The email had been an insult wrapped in a compliment, a kind of professional humiliation Dr. Ely Vance had grown accustomed to. It praised his unflinching commitment to empirical fact and his reputation for dismantling historical mythologies. Then came the punchline, a 5-figure contract to spend a week debunking ghost stories at the Alamo. It was the academic equivalent of hiring a theoretical physicist to investigate a leaky faucet. Eli, a man whose tweed jacket seemed permanently infused with the scent of archival dust and disappointment, reread the message on his laptop. The glow illuminated the lines of failure etched around his eyes. He was 45, but the ghost of his lost tenure at Yale made him feel ancient. One overlooked footnote, one rival with a sharper knife, and a decade of groundbreaking work on colonial supply chains became a historical footnote itself. Now he wrote freelance articles for glossy magazines and took jobs like this. The client was the Alamo Trust's ambitious new board, a collection of tech brothers and oil heiresses who wanted to drag the Texas shrine into the 21st century. Their pitch, delivered via a painfully enthusiastic Zoom call with a man named Carter, was for a fully immersive, historically unimpeachable, augmented reality experience. We want visitors to see the battle, not some spooky TV show, Carter had said, his smile too white. Your job, Dr. Vance, is to be our silver bullet. Go in, spend a few nights, and write a definitive report that proves every orb is dust and every whisper is the air conditioning. We need your academic weight to officially declare the Alamo ghost-free. So here he was, standing before the iconic facade as the Texas sun bled across the San Antonio sky. To the tourists snapping selfies, it was a hallowed symbol of courage. To Eli, it was a compromised historical site, its original limestone suffocated by layers of cement repairs, commercialism, and suffocating myth. He saw not a shrine, but a puzzle box of conflicting accounts and architectural lies. He was granted access after the last tourist had departed, the heavy wooden doors closing behind him with a sound like a sigh of relief. The silence that descended was profound, a physical presence. His guide, a weary security guard named Hoare, gave him a set of keys and a simple instruction. Don't touch anything that looks original. And ... be respectful. This is a quiet place at night. All places are quiet when they're empty, Hoare, Eli had replied, his voice drier than the pages of a 17th century ledger. Alone, Eli began his ritual. It was a meticulous, almost sacred process that was the true source of his professional pride. He unpacked 3 Pelican cases with the care of a bomb disposal expert. First came the audio equipment, 4 digital recorders and a parabolic microphone capable of capturing a mouse's heartbeat across a courtyard. Next, the visual, 2 full-spectrum cameras and a state-of-the-art thermal imager that could show the heat signature of a handprint on a cold stone wall. Finally, the environmental sensors, EMF meters, thermometers, and barometers to detect any rational explanation for a sudden chill. He wasn't hunting ghosts. He was hunting the mundane explanations that people mistook for them. He set up his base of operations in the gift shop, a sacrilegious command center amidst racks of coonskin caps and miniature cannons. His first sweep was of the long barrack, its 2-foot-thick walls holding the night's chill. His instruments remained stubbornly silent. The EMF meters gave no flicker. The thermal camera showed only the slow, steady cooling of stone. He moved to the famous chapel, its arched roof a black void above him. He stood on the very spot where the last defenders were said to have fallen. He felt nothing. No sorrow, no spectral energy. Just the weight of history, a force he understood and respected, but which was no more supernatural than gravity. Retreating to his command center, he settled in for a long, boring night of data collection. He brewed coffee in a travel mug, the scent of dark roast a small comfort in the vast, silent dark. Hours passed. The only sounds were the hum of his laptop and the distant moan of San Antonio traffic. He felt a familiar, smug satisfaction. It was always like this. The legends were always bigger than the reality. At 3 a.m., he began packing up some of his more sensitive gear. The first night was a bust, as expected. It wasn't until he sat down to perform a preliminary review of the audio files, more out of habit than expectation, that his world tilted on its axis. He plugged his headphones in, isolating the feed from the recorder he'd left in the chapel sacristy. He fast-forwarded through hours of ambient silence. Then he stopped, rewound, and listened again. There, a sound, so faint it was almost subliminal. He ran the file through an amplification filter, the waveform on his screen jumping. He cleaned up the background hiss, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He listened a third time. It was not the wind. It was not radio interference. It was a whisper, clear and close, as if spoken directly into the microphone's diaphragm. It was a woman's voice, speaking in perfect Castilian Spanish, her tone not angry or sad, but filled with a kind of weary, urgent warning. No isparati. It is not for you. Eli ripped the headphones from his ears, his breath catching in his throat. The gift shop was silent. The thermal camera, still running, showed nothing but his own fading heat signature on the chair he just vacated. He checked the recorder's logs. There were no power fluctuations, no errors. He played the sound again, this time through the laptop speakers. The whisper filled the small space, an impossible, intimate violation of the sterile silence. For the first time in a decade, Dr. Eli Vance, the great debunker, the man of empirical fact, had recorded a piece of data for which he had no explanation at all. And in the absolute, oppressive silence of the Alamo, he felt a chilling certainty that whatever had spoken was not warning away the tourists. It was warning him. Sleep did not come. Eli spent the hours before dawn in a state of cold, clinical denial, replaying the whisper, no isparati, until the words lost all meaning and became a mere artifact of sound. He ran a full diagnostic on the recorder, finding no faults. He cross-referenced local radio frequencies and emergency service bands for the exact time of the recording, searching for any possible bleed-through. Nothing. He even researched a phenomenon he loathed. electronic voice phenomena, convincing himself it was a case of auditory pareidolia, the brain creating patterns from random noise. But the clarity of the voice, its perfect Castilian diction, defied such a simple dismissal. The seed of doubt, planted in the sterile silence of the gift shop, had begun to germinate in the dark soil of his exhaustion. When the sun finally rose, casting long, forgiving shadows across the courtyard, Eli threw himself into his work with a renewed, almost frantic sense of purpose. He would beat this thing with facts. He sequestered himself in the Alamo's research library, a small, climate-controlled room smelling of brittle paper and preservation chemicals. His focus for the day, the long barrack. He pulled first-hand accounts of the battle, his fingers tracing the desperate, spidery script of men long dead. The documents painted a picture not of heroic defiance, but of brutal, claustrophobic butchery. The long barrack had been a meat grinder. Soldiers described the air growing thick with gunpowder smoke, and the screams of the wounded, the clang of bayonets on rifle barrels, the wet thud of blades finding flesh. As he read, a palpable feeling of being watched crept over him. It was a familiar sensation for anyone who has worked alone in a library, but this was different. It was pointed. He would look up from a passage describing a soldier dying in a specific corner, and his eyes would be drawn to the window, to that very corner of the real long barrack outside. He dismissed it as the power of suggestion, his academic mind providing its own context. But the feeling persisted, a cold pressure at the base of his neck. That evening, as Jorge locked the gates, the security guard gave him a long, searching look. "You find any of our quiet residents last night, Doc?" "The only thing I found was a faulty audio file," Eli lied, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. This time, he concentrated his entire arsenal of equipment within the cavernous, 2-story long barrack. He placed a recorder every 20 feet, set up a thermal camera on a tripod facing the length of the hall, and kept his EMF meter clutched in his hand like a talisman. For the first hour, there was nothing but the comforting silence of stone and history. His skepticism, which had been so violently assaulted, began to painfully reassert itself. He was a fool, spooked by a stray radio signal. Then the air changed. It began with a smell, faint at first, then unmistakable. The acrid metallic tongue of spent gunpowder, mixed with the sharp scent of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. Eli lifted his nose, sniffing. It was impossible. The ventilation system was a sealed, modern unit. He noted the time and the phenomenon in his logbook, his handwriting tight and precise. A sound followed. From the far end of the barrack, where a blacksmith's forge had once stood, came a distinct, percussive clang. Clang dot dot dot, clang dot dot dot, clang. It was the sound of a hammer striking an anvil, rhythmic and powerful. Eli froze, his blood turning to ice. The sound grew faster, more frantic, a desperate, angry beat that echoed off the thick limestone walls before stopping as abruptly as it began. He grabbed his thermal camera and a flashlight, his academic curiosity now locked in a mortal struggle with his primal instinct to flee. He walked slowly toward the forge area, his footsteps unnervingly loud in the sudden silence. The area was empty, of course, but his thermal camera showed something his eyes couldn't see. On the face of the anvil, a hand-shaped heat signature glowed a faint orange, a residual heat that was fading even as he watched. He was turning to go back when he walked through it, a pocket of air so intensely cold it felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. But the cold was just the beginning. The moment it enveloped him, a bolt of pure agony shot through his right side. It was a sharp, piercing, tearing pain, so vivid and specific he could almost feel the triangular shape of the bayonet that wasn't there. He gasped, a strangled cry escaping his lips as he dropped to one knee, clutching a wound that didn't exist. His mind screamed in protest, but his nervous system was convinced it was dying. He stumbled back, panting, sweat beading on his forehead. The pain receded as quickly as it came, leaving a dull, throbbing ache in its place. He ripped his shirt up. There was no mark, no blood. But when he swung the thermal camera to look at his own side, he saw it. A dark, cold spot blooming on his skin beneath his shirt, a phantom bruise visible only in the infrared spectrum. Before he could even process the implications, a new sound ripped through the silence. From a small, darkened storeroom at the opposite end of the barrack, he heard a man's voice, pleading desperately in Spanish. Por favor, no. Tengo una familia. Misericordia. This was no echo. This was happening now. Driven by a terrifying, all-consuming need to know, Eli grabbed his parabolic microphone and his full-spectrum camera. He crept toward the storeroom, the man's terrified sobs growing louder. The pleas cut off suddenly, replaced by a sickening, wet, gurgling noise that would haunt Eli for the rest of his life. The storeroom door, which had been slightly ajar, slammed shut with a deafening bang. Eli was thrown back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was alone in the vast, dark hall. Silence. He fumbled with his flashlight, its beam cutting a trembling swath across the stone floor as he forced himself toward the door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open. The room was empty, but on the rough-hewn wooden floor, a dark, viscous pool of liquid was spreading rapidly from the center of the room. It was thick, almost black in the flashlight's beam, and the coppery scent of fresh blood filled the small space. It was real. It was there. He lifted his camera, his hands shaking so violently he could barely frame the shot. He had to document it. Proof. But as he watched through the camera's viewfinder, the impossible happened. The edges of the pool began to steam, a faint white vapor rising from it. The puddle shrank, sizzling silently, evaporating into the dry Texas air. Within 30 seconds, the floor was bone dry, as if nothing had ever been there. Eli stood frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't a residual haunting. This wasn't a psychic echo. This was a performance. A sequential, interactive, and malevolent display of power. The whisper in the chapel, the pain in his side, the phantom murder. It was a story being told, and he was its sole audience. His wild eyes darted around the long barrack, then across the moonlit courtyard, settling on the dark, silent facade of the chapel. He felt a dreadful, undeniable pull. These weren't random events. They were a trail of breadcrumbs, laid out by an unseen intelligence, and he knew with a gut-wrenching certainty where the trail was leading him next. The walk across the moonlit courtyard was the longest of Eli's life. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. The rational, ordered world he had inhabited for 45 years had been systematically dismantled in the space of a few hours. The events in the long barrack were not random psychic residue. They were a meticulously crafted narrative of terror, and he was being herded toward the final act. The dark maw of the chapel entrance beckoned, not as a place of sanctuary, but as the story's inevitable, horrifying conclusion. He forced himself through the doors. Inside, the air was different. The long barrack had felt charged with chaotic, violent energy. The chapel was still, but with a heavy, ancient stillness like the bottom of the ocean. It felt like a place of judgment. His scientific curiosity, though battered and bleeding, was the only thing keeping him from sprinting out into the San Antonio night. He was no longer a debunker. He was an unwilling explorer, charting the coastline of an impossible continent. His focus narrowed to the sacristy, the small room off the main chamber. History knew it as the place where a handful of the last defenders had been cornered and slaughtered. It was the nexus of the Alamo's mythos, the bloody heart of the legend. If the performance was leading anywhere, it was here. He set up his equipment with trembling hands, the familiar clicks and beeps a flimsy shield against the oppressive silence. He placed audio recorders, but he no longer expected whispers. He activated the full spectrum camera, but he no longer expected to see a ghostly soldier. The intelligence at work here was far more subtle and far more alien. His primary tool now was the thermal imager. The phantom pain, the evaporating blood, they had left thermal traces. It was the only sense he felt he could still trust. He began to scan the thick limestone walls, the camera's display rendering the world in a ghostly palette of blues, greens, and oranges. He swept it over the floor, the altar, the centuries-old stones. Everything was a uniform, cooling blue as expected. He moved the lens up the wall where historical accounts said the final, desperate struggle had occurred. He was looking for cold spots, drafts from cracks in the masonry, anything to explain the phantom chill he'd felt earlier. He found one. A section of wall, roughly head-high, was a shade of deeper, colder blue than the stone around it. He zoomed in. The temperature reading on the display dropped steadily as he focused on the spot. 5 degrees colder. 10. 15. This was a significant anomaly. He stepped closer, his own warm orange silhouette on the screen approaching the growing patch of cold. Then the camera glitched. The screen dissolved into a cascade of digital static, a harsh electric hiss crackling from the device's small speaker. Eli cursed, tapping the side of the unit. The static cleared for a split second, and in that fraction of time, he saw it. It was not a cold spot. It was a void. On the screen, where the patch of blue had been, There was now a perfect absence of color and temperature. It was a hole in the thermal world. And from that hole, a face stared out at him. It was a human face, stretched in a silent, agonized screen, its features carved from negative space. The eyes were pits of absolute cold, the mouth a gaping maw of nothingness. It wasn't a heat signature. It was a heat vacuum. It was a face made of pure, predatory emptiness, embedded within the very fabric of the stone. The image lasted for less than a heartbeat before the screen flooded with static again. Eli stumbled back, dropping the camera. It hit the stone floor with a sickening crack. He scrambled for his flashlight, his breath catching in a sob, and aimed its beam at the wall. There was nothing there, just solid, impassive limestone, etched with the marks of time. He stood panting, his mind reeling. The afterimage of that screaming, hollow face burned onto the inside of his eyelids. He had seen the monster. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but something else entirely. Something that lived in the stone. Something that wore the tragedies of this place like a mask. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. He didn't dare retrieve the broken camera. He packed his remaining gear with frantic, clumsy movements and practically ran from the chapel, waiting out the final hours of darkness huddled in the gift shop, watching the chapel doors as if he expected the face to emerge from them. The next day, sleep-deprived and running on pure adrenaline, he returned to the archives. He wasn't looking for battle accounts anymore. He was looking for anything, any mention of strange occurrences before the famous battle. He dug through mission construction logs, supply manifests, and the diaries of the Franciscan friars who had first settled this place. Late in the afternoon, he found it, tucked away in a box of miscellaneous post-battle documents was a small leather-bound journal. It belonged to a man named Corporal Manuel de la Pina, a member of the Mexican Army's cleanup crew, tasked with clearing the bodies and sanctifying the chapel in the days after the siege. Most of the entries were grim, matter-of-fact accounts of the carnage. But the final entry, dated March 10th, 1836, was different. "We have cleared the last of the bodies from the church," he wrote in a spidery, hurried hand. "But there is a wrongness in this place that has naught to do with the recent bloodshed. One section of the sacristy wall near the altar is unnaturally cold and dark. It does not reflect the light from our lanterns, but seems to swallow it. The men are afraid of it. Father Augustine tried to bless the spot, but as he sprinkled the holy water, it sizzled upon the stone as if touching a hot griddle, though it was cold to the touch. He says it is a place of deep sorrow. I believe it is a place of deep hunger." Eli's blood ran cold. He slammed the journal shut, his mind racing. It wasn't the battle. The battle hadn't created the entity. The bloodshed had just awakened it. It had fed it. The ghosts of the Alamo defenders weren't the haunting. They were the bait. They were the lure for a trap that had been set in stone for centuries, waiting patiently for its next meal. The journal of Corporal de la Pina was a key, but it opened a door into a darkness Eli was completely unequipped to navigate. His expertise, his entire intellectual framework, was built upon the written records of European colonists. He was a master of a history that began in 1492. The face in the wall and the corporal's terrified scribblings spoke of something far older, a horror that wore the Battle of the Alamo like a new coat. The ghosts of the defenders were a symptom, not the disease. To understand the disease, he had to dig deeper than the mission's foundations. His frantic, bleary-eyed research led him to a name, Dr. Ana Flores. She was an adjunct professor at UTSA, a historian whose work existed in the academic margins Eli had always avoided. Her specialty was the ethnography of the Coahuiltecan people, the loose confederation of hunter-gatherer tribes, including the Payai, who had inhabited this land for thousands of years before the first Spanish friar arrived. She was an authority on the history that had been paved over to build the mission. He found her email address and composed a message, carefully editing out the raw terror and framing his request as a matter of professional thoroughness. He was seeking pre-colonial context, he wrote, to understand the indigenous belief systems that might have shaped early perceptions of the Mizian San Antonio de Valero. It was a weak, transparent lie, and he knew it. They met at a quiet, sun-drenched coffee shop miles from the tourist traps. Ana Flores was a woman who seemed to carry her own center of gravity. Her sharp, intelligent eyes missed nothing, and she regarded Eli over the rim of her mug with a polite but profound skepticism. She had clearly dealt with men like him before, outsiders looking to spice up their sensationalist narratives with a dash of native legend. "Dr. Vance," she began, her voice calm and even, "my people's history isn't a footnote for your client's ghost tour." The directness of the challenge disarmed him. The academic arrogance he usually wore as armor had been shattered, and all he had left was the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man who had seen a hole in the world. He decided on a gamble. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out his laptop, turned it around, and played the audio file from the first night. The woman's whisper, "No is parati," filled the space between them. Anna's expression shifted instantly. The skepticism vanished, replaced by a deep ancestral gravity. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "Where did you record this?" "In the sacristy." "Night before last." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. "What you're dealing with," she said finally, her voice low, "is not the spirit of a soldier. The Spanish missionaries, they built their church on a place of power. To my ancestors, the Payaya, this bend in the river was sacred, but it was also feared. It was the heart of a genius loci, a spirit of the place. We called it Yanowana, the hungering shade." Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cafe's air conditioning. "A spirit? Not a ghost of a person," Anna corrected. "Something more elemental. A presence that was drawn to strong emotion, to passion, to fear, to rage. It was a mimic. It could learn voices, shapes, memories. It would use them to lure the living, to feed on their energy. The friars thought they were conquering a wilderness for God. In reality, they built a stone trap on top of its heart, and for 100 years, it slept. And the battle?" Eli whispered. The battle, Anna said, her eyes dark with the weight of the word, was a feast. A cataclysm of terror, agony, and defiant rage that gorged the entity. It gave it power beyond anything my ancestors could have imagined. It learned the faces of heroes, the sounds of battle, the pain of 1,000 violent deaths. The ghosts of the Alamo aren't the men who died there. They are the masks the hungering shade now wears to hide its true face. That night, armed with this terrifying new context, Eli did not return to the Alamo as a researcher. He returned as a man entering a predator's territory. Every sound, every shadow was now filtered through the lens of Anna's story. The clang of the hammer, the phantom pain, it was the creature learning him, testing his reactions. He was drawn, as if by an invisible string, to a small, low-ceilinged chamber off the main chapel he hadn't explored before. A faint sound emanated from within. It wasn't one voice, but many. The overlapping whispers and soft, sorrowful cries of children. He thought of the corporal's journal, of the families who had taken refuge in the mission. He stepped toward the sound, his hand outstretched for the doorframe. The instant his fingers touched the wood, the heavy chamber door slammed shut with the force of a battering ram, plunging him into absolute, suffocating blackness. The air dropped in temperature, and the whispers exploded around him, no longer in Spanish or English, but in the sharp, guttural clicks and soft vowels of a language he now recognized as Coawiltican. Then came the touch. An ice-cold small hand wrapped around his ankle. He cried out, kicking his leg free, stumbling back against the wall. Another hand grabbed the cuff of his trousers. More hands, dozens of them, clutched at his clothes, his arms, his legs, their chilling grip impossibly strong. They weren't trying to hurt him. They were trying to pull him down, to drag him to the floor. He flailed wildly in the dark, a primal scream tearing from his throat. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slipping on the screen before he finally managed to activate the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and Eli's scream died in his throat. For a horrifying second, he saw them. A swarm of small, shadowy forms, their outlines indistinct and wavering. They had the shape of children, but their faces were hollowed out pits of deeper shadow, their mouths stretched wide in silent, eternal screams. The light struck them, and they recoiled with a unified, soundless shriek, dissolving like smoke in a harsh wind. He was alone, collapsed on the stone floor, gasping for breath, the phantom chill of their touch still burning on his skin. He finally understood. The whisper from the first night wasn't a warning. It was a claim. It is not for you. The Alamo, the history, the very air he was breathing, it belonged to the shade. The children were its first puppets, their stolen spirits twisted into a lure. And now it was weaving a new one, tailored just for him. Eli scrambled out of the chamber of phantom children, his body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable ague. He didn't stop running until he was back in the relative safety of the gift shop, where he collapsed against the door, his back sliding down the wood until he was a heap on the floor. The line had been crossed. The entity was no longer testing him, or telling a story. It had declared war. The academic exercise was over. This was a battle for his sanity, and he was losing. He knew he should leave. He should pack his shattered equipment, walk out the front gate, and never look back. He should call Carter and tell him the job was off, that the place was a tomb, and that they should bulldoze it and salt the earth. But he couldn't. A cold, terrifying certainty had taken root in his soul. It wouldn't let him go. He had seen its true face, and now it would never turn away. Leaving the Alamo would be like a soldier trying to walk away from a battlefield in the middle of a firefight. The entity, for its part, seemed to understand this. It sensed the shift in his awareness. The subtle, atmospheric tactics, the whispers, the cold spots, the echoes of pain were no longer sufficient. Now that Eli knew he was facing a single, malevolent intelligence, the hungering shade changed its strategy. It would no longer haunt the building. It would haunt him. The assault began without warning. One moment, Eli was huddled by his laptop, frantically typing notes. The next, the low hum of the machine was drowned out by a deafening roar. It was the sound of a cannonade, so close and so powerful that the floor vibrated, rattling the shelves of souvenir-shot glasses. He clapped his hands over his ears as the air filled with the splintering crack of wood and the whistle of incoming fire. The walls of the gift shop flickered, becoming translucent, and for a horrifying moment, he saw the courtyard outside filled with smoke, running men, and the flash of musket fire. He was in the middle of the final assault. The illusion was flawless, a hyper-realistic sensory overload. The smell of blood and acrid smoke burned his nostrils. The screams of dying men, in both English and Spanish, echoed from every direction. It was a symphony of chaos designed to overwhelm and shatter his senses. He stumbled out into the chapel, seeking refuge, but the hallucination followed him, bleeding into the very stones. He saw a vision of William B. Travis, the Alamo's heroic commander, but the entity had twisted the legend into a weapon against him. Travis wasn't defiantly drawing a line in the sand. He was backed into a corner, his face pale with terror, his sword trembling in his hand as he wept uncontrollably. The sight was a dagger in Eli's own heart, a mockery of his own intellectual cowardice in the face of the unknown. Then, the entity personalized the attack. A figure strode through the smoke and chaos. A phantom General Santa Anna, his uniform immaculate, his face cruel and triumphant. But as the figure drew closer, its features shifted, melting and reforming into the sneering, condescending face of Dr. Alistair Finch, the man who had orchestrated Eli's professional ruin at Yale. Still chasing ghosts, Eli? The phantom mocked, its voice a perfect imitation of Finch's patronizing tone. Always reaching for things you can't grasp. You are a footnote, a man destined to be remembered only for his failures. Eli cried out, a raw denial, and scrambled away, deeper into the sacristy. The phantoms of the battle faded, the roar of cannons receding, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. He was backed against the far wall, the cold wall panting, his mind a battlefield of past trauma and present terror. And then the shade deployed its cruelest weapon. Eli? The voice was soft, gentle, and achingly familiar. It cut through his terror like a beam of pure light. It was the voice of his wife, Sarah. He hadn't heard it in 5 years, not since the rainy night a slick road and a moment's inattention had stolen it from him forever. He turned, his heart seizing in his chest. An apparition stood in the doorway of the sacristy. It was her. Not a shadowy form or a ghostly echo, but Sarah, solid and real, wearing the simple blue dress she had worn on their last anniversary. Her smile was just as he remembered it, the one that could calm any storm in his soul. "Sarah?" he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. She stepped toward him, her expression softening with love and pity. "Oh, my brilliant, foolish Eli," still trying to explain the whole world. She reached out, her hand gently cupping his cheek. Her touch was warm, real. He leaned into her touch, sobbing her name. "You could have saved me," she whispered, her voice losing its warmth, becoming as cold as the stone behind him. Her thumb pressed cruelly into his cheek. "You just had to look up from the road, Eli, just for a second. But you were distracted, thinking about your work, always thinking. It was your fault." Eli stared in horror as her loving expression curdled. Her skin seemed to gray, her eyes sinking back into her skull, becoming hollow pits of shadow. Her smile stretched, widened, and tore open into the silent, screaming maw of the face from the wall. He shrieked, shoving the monstrous thing away from him. The apparition dissolved into a cloud of black dust, and he was left alone, his wife's final, damning words echoing in the crushing silence. The siege was complete. His mind was broken. He could no longer trust his eyes, his ears, or his memories. History, his personal grief, and the entity's malevolence had all been woven into a single, inescapable nightmare. The Alamo was no longer a place. It was a prison built from the bricks of his own trauma. With a final, guttural cry of despair, he began to drag a heavy wooden bench across the sacristy entrance, barricading himself in. He was making his last stand, not against an army, but against himself. The first light of dawn found Anna, Flores pacing on the sidewalk across from the Alamo. Eli had missed their 4 a.m. check-in call. On its own, that might mean nothing, but it was the final, jarring note in his symphony of wrongness. His preliminary reports to the museum, which she had been forwarded by a panicked Carter, had devolved from dry academic analysis into rambling, paranoid prose poetry. The last one, said just before midnight, was a single terrifying sentence. "It wears their faces." Her decision was made. She drove through the sleeping city, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. When she arrived, she found Carter already there, his expensive suit looking rumpled and his face pinched with fury. He was arguing with Horror, the night guard, who was refusing to unlock the gates before the day staff arrived. His contract is terminated, effective immediately. Carter seethed, jabbing a finger toward the silent chapel. "He's had a breakdown. I need to get our equipment out before he smashes $1 million thermal camera." "The place is quiet, Mr. Carter," Jorge said, his face impassive. "Let the man have his dignity. We can get him at 7. I need to get in there now." Anna interrupted, her voice cutting through their argument. Carter turned to her, his frustration finding a new target. "Dr. Flores, you're the one who encouraged this. You and your native superstitions. He's probably in there chanting at the walls because of you. Let me talk to him," Anna said, ignoring the barb. "He's not having a breakdown. He's under attack." Her certainty was so absolute, it momentarily silenced both men. Jorge gave a slow, weary nod and turned his key in the lock. The gate groaned open. The courtyard was unnaturally still. The air was heavy, stagnant with a lingering malice. Anna walked with purpose, Carter trailing nervously behind her. They found the sacristy door barricaded from the inside with a heavy wooden bench. "Eli," Anna called out, her voice echoing in the chapel. "Eli, it's Anna. Talk to me." A frantic scrabbling came from within, followed by a choked whisper. "No, no more. You're not real." It wears her face. Now it wears yours. "It's me, Eli," she said, her voice soft but firm. She knelt by the door. "Listen to me. My grandmother's name was Silali. When I was 7, I fell from a pecan tree and broke my arm. The scar is on my left elbow, and it looks like a tiny crescent moon. Ask your monster if it knows that." There was silence from behind the door. The entity was a mimic, a brilliant one, but it could only know what was in Eli's mind or what was part of the Alamo's bloody history. It couldn't know the specific mundane truths of Anna's life. She's not here," Eli's voice stammered, thin and broken. "The ... the other one. Sarah. It knew about the road. Because it knows your pain, Eli. It's a parasite. It's feeding on you," Anna explained, pressing her advantage. "I'm real. I'm outside this door. You have to let me in." Slowly, painfully, the sound of the bench being dragged across the stone floor echoed from the room. The door creaked open, and the man who peered out was a ghost of the scholar Anna had met. His eyes were wild, his face was streaked with dirt and tears, and his hands trembled. He looked at her, then at Carter, who recoiled at the sight of him. Eli flinched back from Carter, his eyes wide with terror. "He's one of them," Eli whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the businessman. "He's wearing a mask." "He's just a man, Eli," Anna said gently, stepping between them and guiding Eli out into the chapel. "The shade is trying to isolate you, to make you trust nothing." As Eli stumbled into the light, Carter's anger dissolved into a horrified pity. "My God, get him out of here. Get him to a hospital." "He doesn't need a hospital," Anna said, her gaze fixed on the cold wall of the sacristy. "He needs to fight back." She sat with Eli on a pew as the sun rose higher, its golden light pouring through the high windows, a seeming benediction that felt like a lie. She had him drink water and methodically recount every event, from the first whisper to the phantom children to the horrific vision of his wife. As he spoke, the pieces began to click into place, forming a picture more terrifying than any ghost story. "It's not just feeding," Anna said when he finished, her voice grim. "It's preparing you. It's hollowing you out to make you a vessel." "A vessel for what?" Eli asked, his voice hoarse. "For itself. For a new story," she explained. "Think about it, Eli. As a historian, you know that legends fade. The story of the Alamo, of Bowie and Crockett, is powerful, but in the modern world, it's becoming a caricature, a gift shop memory. The shade's power is tied to the potency of the story, and its anchor is weakening." A look of dawning, intellectual horror spread across Eli's face. "It needs a new ghost. It needs a new myth," Anna corrected, "a modern one. The story of the brilliant, skeptical scholar who came to debunk the ghosts only to be driven mad and consumed by them. A man of science broken by the supernatural. That's a powerful story. It's a legend for the 21st century. It would anchor the shade here for another 100 years, stronger than ever." Eli stared at her, the final, horrifying truth settling upon him. The entity didn't just want to kill him or scare him. It wanted to absorb him. It wanted to steal his mind, his history, his tragedy, and turn him into its next great performance. He was to be its masterpiece. "The last defender," Eli whispered, the words tasting like poison. "Exactly," Anna affirmed. "The last man to make a stand at the Alamo, not with a rifle, but with his own sanity." For the first time in days, a flicker of the old Eli returned. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his gut, but it was now joined by a surge of academic fury. He was a historian, a man who curated and protected stories. This creature, this ancient parasite, was a plagiarist and a murderer, twisting history to serve its own endless hunger. "No," he said, his voice gaining strength. He stood up, his back straightening. "This is my story. This is my history. It doesn't get to write the ending. The siege was over, but the war had just begun." He was no longer a victim cowering behind a barricade. He was a scholar who had found his thesis, and he would not let it be stolen. The sun, which had felt like a lie just hours before, now became a strategist's lamp. In the relative safety of the light-filled chapel, the fear remained, but it had been transmuted into something new: purpose. Carter, the museum representative, stood by the entrance, his face the color of ash. He had seen Eli's state, heard the story, and the world of profit margins and stakeholder meetings had crumbled around him. "We need to call the police. An ambulance. Hell, call the Vatican. I don't care." He stammered, his phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "And tell them what?" Eli countered, his voice steady for the first time in days. "That the Alamo is haunted by a pre-colonial entity that feeds on historical myth. They'd put me in a padded cell, not the ghost. This is insane." "You can't stay here another night," Carter insisted. "This thing has been feeding on the legend of heroic sacrifice for almost 200 years, Eli said, looking at Anna, who nodded in affirmation. "It thrives on high-emotion rage, terror, glory. It's a feast for it. We've been feeding it exactly what it wants. So, what's the alternative? Anna asked, though she already saw the answer in his eyes. Eli's gaze drifted to his laptop, his bag of notes, his research, his arsenal. We starve it, he said. We perform a historical exorcism. No prayers, no holy water. Just the cold, hard, unglamorous truth. We strip the legend bare until there's nothing left for it to feed on. Carter stared at him, aghast. You're going to fight a monster by giving it a lecture? Precisely, Eli said, a flicker of his old sharp intellect returning. It wants a story of heroes making a last stand. I'm going to give it a story of dysentery, tactical blunders, and terrified men dying for a cause many of them barely understood. I will not give it glory. I will give it a post-mortem. That was the final straw for Carter. He backed away, shaking his head. I'm out. The contract is void. I'm washing my hands of this. You're both insane. He turned and practically fled the chapel, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. They were alone. They spent the day preparing. While Anna sat quietly in a pew, her eyes closed in a state of deep meditation that seemed to be its own form of preparation, Eli worked with a feverish intensity he hadn't felt since his doctoral defense. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was a scholar preparing for the ultimate peer review. He cross-referenced diaries, compiled lists of the sick and wounded, and mapped out the logistical failures of the garrison. He focused on the forgotten names, the men who died not from a glorious bayonet charge, but from infection or a stray piece of shrapnel while hiding in a ditch. He was weaponizing the mundane. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, they knew it was time. They walked together into the sacristy. The air inside was thick and cold, humming with a palpable sense of anticipation. The hungering shade was waiting for them. It knew they had returned to its lair. Eli set his laptop on a small stone ledge, its screen casting a pale clinical light on the ancient walls. He took a deep breath and stood before the cold spot, the place where he had seen the face. It's going to fight back, Anna warned, her voice a low whisper. It will use your own memories, your own pain. Don't let it. Stay in the text. I'll be your anchor. Eli nodded, his eyes fixed on the wall. Let's begin, he said, and his voice took on the measured academic tone of a lecturer. The defense of the Alamo, contrary to popular myth, was not a strategic masterstroke, but a cascade of critical errors. As he spoke, the entity began its counterattack. A low moan filled the room, and the phantom smell of gunpowder returned. Eli ignored it, detailing the flawed design of the fort's outer walls. The moan grew into the sound of screams, the clash of steel, the roar of cannons. He pushed on, his voice unwavering, discussing the outbreak of typhus that had weakened the garrison days before the final assault. Then the vision of Sarah appeared before him, her face etched with sorrow. Eli, stop, she pleaded, her voice a perfect echo of his memory. These men were heroes. You're dishonoring them. You're dishonoring me. His voice faltered. His heart clenched in a fist of ice. He saw the rain-slicked road, felt the sickening lurch of the car. Anna's hand clamped down on his arm, her grip firm and grounding. "It's a lie, Eli," she hissed. "It's a puppet. Stick to the truth." He tore his eyes away from the phantom, forcing them back to the cold, impassive stone. He took a shuddering breath and continued, his voice shaking but resolute. He moved on to the final assault, but he didn't speak of heroes. He spoke of chaos, of friendly fire in the smoke-filled confusion, of men tripping in the dark and being trampled. The entity escalated. The walls around them seemed to melt away, replaced by a swirling vortex of fire and screaming faces. The phantom of Alistair Finch appeared, laughing, pointing. "A footnote, Eli. Even your ghost story is boring." "Focus," Anna commanded. "Find one. Find one truth it cannot twist." Eli frantically scrolled through his notes, his eyes scanning for a name, an anchor point. He found it. "Gregorio Esparza," he said, his voice rising above the din. "He brought his family inside the walls, believing they would be safe. He died defending the chapel, but his death wasn't a blaze of glory." Eli locked his gaze on the wall, on the heart of the shade. According to the account of his own son Enrique, who survived, Gregorio was not killed by a bayonet charge. He was struck in the chest by a stray cannonball fragment that came through the roof. He died instantly, cowering in this very corner, trying to shield his family. There was no final word, no defiant cry, just a surprised grunt and a spray of blood, an undignified, random, pointless death in the dark. He shouted the last words, his voice raw with the power of unvarnished fact. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The grand illusions of the battle, of Sarah, of Finch, they didn't fade. They shattered like glass. The heroic phantoms of Travis and Crockett flickered and distorted, their faces twisting into agonized masks as the monstrous, amorphous shadow beneath them was revealed. And from the wall, from the very heart of the entity, came a sound unlike any before. It was not a moan of sorrow or a roar of battle. It was a high-pitched, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated rage and frustrated hunger. The line had been drawn. The historian had struck a blow, and for the first time, the hungering shade was bleeding. The shriek of the hungering shade was not merely a sound. It was a physical force. The ancient limestone of the sacristy groaned under the pressure of its rage. A spiderweb of cracks radiated from the cold spot on the wall, and dust rained from the ceiling. The entity, wounded by the raw truth of Gregorio Esparza's death, had abandoned all subtlety. This was the lashing out of a cornered predator. "It's losing control," Anna shouted over the din, her hands pressed against her ears. "Keep going, Eli." But Eli knew that words alone were no longer enough. The entity was trying to break free from its prison of stone. The wall itself began to bulge outward, the mortar between the blocks turning to powder and trickling to the floor. The cold pouring from it was no longer a mere chill. It was a physical wave of life-draining energy that made Eli's teeth ache and his vision swim. In that moment of desperate clarity, Eli understood. To starve the creature, he couldn't just speak the truth. He had to make it permanent. He had to overwrite the myth with an official record. He fumbled in his bag, his numb fingers finding the small, solid rectangle of his digital audio recorder. He clicked it on, the small red light, a defiant spark in the growing gloom. "You want a story?" He roared at the bulging wall, his voice raw with a scholar's fury. "I'll give you a story for the ages." This is Dr. Elias Vance, recording my official findings for the Alamo Trust, March 12th. He began to dictate, not just reciting facts, but delivering his final report. He poured every ounce of his academic rigor, his pain, and his terror into the recording. The paranormal phenomena at this site are not the product of restless human spirits. They are the predatory manifestations of a single, non-human entity, a genius loci that has been misidentified for 2 centuries. Its power is derived not from fact, but from the emotional resonance of historical narrative. As he spoke, the screaming face in the stone solidified, its features twisting with fury. Shadowy tendrils, like wisps of black smoke given solid form, lashed out from the cracks in the wall. They wrapped around Eli's arms and chest, their touch burning with an impossible cold. He gasped as he felt a horrifying draining sensation, his own memories being pulled from his mind. The scent of Sarah's hair, the pride of his graduation day, the sting of his first failure, all being sifted through like files in a cabinet. Eli. Anna screamed. He was being pulled, physically and psychically, toward the wall. He felt his consciousness fraying, the promise of oblivion a sweet, terrible lure. Just as his knees began to buckle, Anna threw herself forward, grabbing him by the shoulders. Her feet braced against the stone floor. She became his anchor to the living world. She locked her eyes on his, pulling his gaze away from the hypnotic void in the wall. Then she began to speak, her voice a low rhythmic chant in the language of her ancestors. It wasn't a prayer or a curse. It was a story, a lullaby. She spoke of the shade in its infancy, of the long, quiet centuries it spent sleeping beneath the earth, of the gentle rhythm of the river, of the quiet turning of the seasons. She was not fighting its hunger. She was reminding it of its long, peaceful sleep. It was a battle of narratives fought in the heart of the Alamo. Eli's cold, factual report stripping the entity of its power. Anna's ancestral lullaby offering it the solace of dormancy. And the shade's ravenous hunger fighting against them both. The pull lessened. The shadowy tendrils wavered. With a final desperate surge of will, Eli shouted into his recorder, "The entity is a parasite of myth. It is weakened by fact and pacified by obscurity. To preserve this site, the legend of the Alamo must be allowed to fade." With those words, the screaming face in the wall contorted one last time, and then imploded. The shadowy tendrils snapped back into the stone. The bulge in the wall receded. The shriek died, replaced by a profound, absolute silence that was deeper than anything Eli had yet experienced. It was the silence of a predator that had been beaten back into its lair, wounded and dormant. The first rays of the rising sun pierced through the sacristy's high window. illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Eli collapsed, his recorder falling from his limp hand. Anna knelt beside him, both of them breathing in ragged, exhausted gasps. They had survived. 6 months later, Eli sat in his apartment, the ever-present scent of old books now mingled with the faint aroma of Anna's coffee. He was no longer the disgraced academic. He was something else, a man who had stared into a hole in the world and had not fallen in. He had submitted his final report to the Alamo Trust. It was a masterpiece of academic writing, detailing the historical inaccuracies, the geological anomalies, and the psychological phenomena, but veiling the true nature of the shade in carefully chosen, ambiguous language. He included a lengthy appendix, co-authored by Dr. Anna Flores, on the pre-colonial folklore of the site, strongly recommending it be integrated into the new tour. The new augmented reality exhibit, Alamo, The Truth Behind the Legend, was a massive success. The board had latched on to the gritty reality angle, creating a tour that was praised for its historical authenticity. They had, of course, omitted the more esoteric warnings from his report. On a bright autumn afternoon, a family stood in the sacristy, the father reading from his phone, while his young son, no older than 10, grew bored. The boy wandered over to the far wall and placed his hand on the cool, ancient stone. His AR glasses, provided by the museum, flickered. A text box was supposed to pop up with information about the non-combatants who sheltered there. For a single frame, a different message appeared on the screen, written in a stark, simple font. "Tell me a story." The boy blinked. He turned to his father. "Dad," he said, his voice perfectly normal, "what happened to the angry man who lived in the wall?" His father looked up from his phone, confused. "What angry man?" The tour guide said this was where the families hid. The boy's eyes, for just a second, seemed to darken, reflecting not the light of the room, but a deep and ancient emptiness. He smiled, a perfectly normal childhood smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh," he said, "okay, can I get a souvenir?" As the family walked away, the boy looked back one last time at the wall, a silent understanding passing between the new hunger and the old. The shade was weak, yes, but it was also patient, and it had just learned how to use a new kind of myth and a new kind of ghost to lure its next meal.